It is January 2019. Zalmay Khalilzad, representing the Trump administration, is telling friends that he has a peace deal with the Taliban. This note, the way to begin the conversation with two authors, Jerry Dunleavy and James Hasson, of a new book, Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. Jerry Dunleavy is helping the investigation by the House Foreign Affairs Committee into the withdrawal from Afghanistan. James Hasson, former Army Captain, graduate of U.S. Army Ranger School, received the Bronze Star for his conduct in Afghanistan and afterwards. Gentlemen, I begin with Zalmay Khalilzad because though he has served several administrations, right now he's no longer prominent in the conversation about Afghanistan. Jerry, what do we need to know about him and why he was tasked by several presidents to represent the United States in that part of the world? Good evening to you, Jerry.
Good evening. So Zalmay Khalilzad, known colloquially just as Zal by the people close to him, is a key figure in why things went so wrong in the final years in Afghanistan. He had, spent many years as a diplomat on behalf of the United States, not just in Afghanistan but in Iraq as well. But he was picked by the Trump administration to help lead peace talks with the Taliban, and Zal very notably largely cut the Afghan Republic and the Afghan government out of those discussions with the Taliban. And so in our book Kabul, we lay out that he ultimately played a very negative and, according to the people that had to work with him back both in the US government and in the Afghan government, played a pretty pernicious role in the way that things went down. And we make no sort of bones about it in our book that the Doha agreement that he ended up striking in early 2020 was a pretty bad deal. And the Biden administration, when they came into power in January of 2021, they decided to keep Zal on. And various people in the Biden administration, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, praised the vital work that he had been doing. Part of why Zal was so problematic was the Afghan government didn't trust him. A lot of people in the US government didn't particularly trust him. And he seemed to misunderstand, I think, at the very least, the intentions of the Taliban, downplaying what the Taliban wanted, claiming that the Taliban wasn't interested in a military victory, telling his Afghan government counterparts that he had cornered the Taliban. And obviously, we saw how that all came falling down in 2021. And ultimately, the debacle that we saw in August 2021 with Americans left behind, Afghans left behind, the Taliban back in power, ultimately that lays the defeat of President Biden and his decision to withdraw without coming up with a plan for how to stop all of the negative repercussions. But Zal played a big role in that. And, the Biden administration ultimately owns that because they decided to keep Zal on and continue to trust Zal in that role.
James, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, comes into office about this time, 2019. Mm-hmm. Is the opinion of the DOD, according to their reports, that it might be possible to maintain order by keeping 2,500 to 3,500 troops. I believe Mr. Trump even talked about it. Is that a realistic number that could have maintained order, at least in Kabul, for the indefinite future, James?
Yeah, I believe it was. And one thing that's important to note is that the military leadership from the people in the Pentagon, at the top brass, all the way down to the guys, in Afghanistan at the time, senior non-commissioned officers and senior leaders, all wanted to keep Bagram Air Base. They wanted to keep Bagram as the central hub of the evacuation. But to circle, like to rewind a little bit, if we had kept forces in the country, the military wanted ideally 3,500, but they said that they could get it done with 2,200. And what that would entail is keeping our embassy open in Kabul, and keeping Hamid Karzai International Airport, HKIA, open, and then running almost all of our operations out of Bagram. And the reason why Bagram is so important, and we'll get to that when we talk about President Biden's decision to abandon Bagram. But the reason why Bagram is so crucial is because it's eminently defensible. It was built by the Soviets when they were in Afghanistan. It has all kinds of standoff distance in terms of open terrain surrounding it, which makes it very difficult to attack. And it has just a plethora of runways where you can operate, unmanned assets. You can operate flights in and out of the country, and really kind of, at the very least, hold a protective radius around Kabul and around Bagram itself, because they're not geographically that far away. So it was absolutely a realistic estimate. And when President Biden decided to withdraw, the military, I think pleaded is the right word, to have the evacuation conducted out of Bagram. And President Biden decided that it wasn't going to happen because he wanted a maximum of 600 U.S. troops in the country, beginning, with kind of the summer of 2021, and you simply can't hold Bagram with 600 troops. And because he made a politically calculated decision that he only wanted 600, we had to give up Bagram. And I'm sure, as we'll get to at some point, also abandon the prison that was housing thousands of ISIS fighters, dozens of al-Qaeda terrorists, and tens of thousands or thousands more, I should say, Taliban fighters.
Yes, there's a deal of foreshadowing in the stories we're telling here. Quickly, Jerry, through February and March, the president was consulting with such as Barack Obama, the former president, whom he served, and Blinken was consulting with NATO, our allies in NATO, the UK, Australia, and others. Was there unanimity about this decision that we could leave Afghanistan? Quickly, we have a couple of minutes.
No, there wasn't unanimity. NATO, of course, went to Afghanistan to help the United States after 9/11. And NATO very much did not want to do a rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan. At the time, NATO forces actually largely outnumbered U.S. forces in the country. And they told Antony Blinken in no uncertain terms in the late winter, early spring of 2021, that to do this would be a disaster. And Blinken actually commented that he was hit with quadraphonic sound, which is sort of from all four corners from NATO telling them that this would be a disaster. But President Biden was not willing to listen to what NATO wanted to do. And so with the United States leaving, NATO decided to leave as well. But it's certainly not something that our NATO partners thought would be a good idea. And you could see in August 2021 how the NATO alliance looked like it was in a bit of a shambles with the disaster that unfolded. And that was due to strong arming from President Biden himself.
The book is Kabul, the untold story of Biden's fiasco and the American warriors who fought to the end. James, I come to you because you've spoken of Bagram, and my understanding is that it was perfectly designed to do what you said, to hold the country together. It's either 40 kilometers or 40 miles outside of Baghdad, outside of Kabul, which would have been perfect for the operation of evacuation. It also had all of the facilities to hold itself with troops, and airbase also was a listening post on China. It was magnificently placed. All of that is true. In doubts raised about leaving Bagram behind, the president and his counselors, Mr. Blinken, Mr. Sullivan, the National Security, were always mentioning 300,000 troops. You and Jerry make 300,000 a little song that they sing for several chapters. What were they talking about, James?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really glad that you asked it, because I think this is an underrated aspect of the Biden administration's decision to withdraw, how they withdrew, and also how they sold it to the American people. As you mentioned, they repeatedly throughout the spring of 2021 and even throughout the summer, after President Biden announced that we were going to withdraw all troops, they repeatedly claimed that the Afghan military was 300,000 strong. And President Biden at one point said, and I believe this was in his April 2021 speech announcing the withdrawal from Afghanistan, claimed that they were therefore almost as strong as any first world country military. And they used this talking point to sell the idea that they could leave and the Afghan military could simply carry on. And that 300,000 figure is just simply false for several reasons. First, the number that their calculation included local police, border police, and all kinds of other semi-paramilitary units, which is absurd, because if you think about it, I mean, we wouldn't say that the U.S. military is 10 million strong because we're counting police forces in Peoria, Illinois, or somewhere else. It just makes no sense. So it was disingenuous on that level. But secondly, there was even among the Afghan military roles themselves, there was a wide known problem of what are called ghost units. They were units that existed entirely on paper, so that a corrupt general or Ministry of Defense figure could collect the salaries for those non-existent soldiers. And this was well known in the Pentagon at the time. It's been documented. It was documented for years prior. And in Kabul, in our book Kabul, we bring the receipts for that. The Pentagon knew that this was the case. So the number was inflated even as to the Afghan military. But when you get to the summer of 2021, I believe even as late as June, General Milley was still hyping this 300,000 figure. In fact, he inflated it at that point to 325,000. Not only were those first two, not only was it inaccurate for the first two reasons I described, but by that time, the Afghan military had been taking significant casualties, a lot of desertions. So even their actual ranks were already depleted. And so I think this was pernicious for two reasons. First, it sold this to the American people as something other than what it was. Because if the administration had simply said, hey, we're going to withdraw, and the Afghan military is probably going to fall apart sooner rather than later, then, well, at least there's a public debate about that. And make no mistake, there was very little doubt that the Afghan military would collapse. We spoke with senior members of CIA who said that the agency's internal assessment was that the Afghan military would collapse in as little as 30 days without U.S. contractor and military support. And the outlying figure, that the greatest number, was 90 days. So they knew that. But I think one of the other reasons why this was so damaging was it gave a lot of American citizens who were in the country working as aid workers, or for the World Bank, or for almost anything else, a false sense of security, because we told them, hey, you don't need to get out now. Things aren't going to collapse. You're fine. And then in a matter of weeks, the Taliban overran, the entire country, and were outside the gates of Kabul. And American citizens and our Afghan allies were stuck behind Taliban lines with very little way to get to safety without endangering their own lives.
And John, all that I would add to that is, on top of the Biden administration pushing this obviously fictional 300,000 strong Afghan military figure, at the same time, as we were pulling all of our troops out in rapid fashion, that also meant pulling our contractors, our logistics, our ISR, our advisors, all of the things that we had built the Afghan military around. And at the same time, even into June, July, and August, the U.S. military still hadn't come up with a plan about how to continue to keep the Afghan military fighting and functioning. So it obviously ended in disaster, and you can see that play out. But the rhetoric that we were using was very misleading, and as we were setting up the Afghan military for failure, we were misleading about its size and its strength.
Jerry Dunleavy, James Hasson, Kabul. The next challenge is to solve the State Department's acronyms. The first is SIV. Second is NEO. I loved it when somebody kept saying, don't say NEO, don't say NEO. I think that might have been the Secretary of State. What is a NEO? Why were they so frightened about it? What does it mean? This is not Saigon. We do have people who were not here then, Jerry. We've got to be careful.
Yeah.
And what is an SIV, and why didn't they know how many SIVs they had? Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the SIV problem. So SIV is a special immigrant visa, and so these are this is the visa program that was set up for our Afghan allies. So our interpreters, Afghan interpreters who help the U.S. military and other folks like that. And the SIV program, which was plagued by problems for many, many, many years, those problems had not been solved by the time that President Biden decided to leave Afghanistan. And so as the U.S. was pulling all of our troops out and the Taliban is rapidly advancing, we have tens of thousands of Afghan allies in the country that we had not come up with a plan about how to get out. And that problem was never fixed and never solved by the time that August 2021 rolled around. And so those tens of thousands of Afghan allies who we had made promises to, because of their years or sometimes their decades of help to the U.S. military and the U.S. NATO mission in Afghanistan, all of those people were stuck behind Taliban lines. And while thanks to the incredible efforts of the U.S. Marines and other service members at Kabul airport during those 2 weeks in mid to late August 2021, thanks to their efforts, we were able to get a few 10,000s of those Afghan allies out. Many more, tens of thousands more, were left behind. And the Biden administration just never put together a plan about what to do for them. In terms of a NEO is a non-combatant evacuation operation. That is what the State Department has to request from the military to conduct an evacuation out of a country like Afghanistan. And the State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Kabul should have been should have known that a NEO would be necessary very early in 2021, but they were in a state of denial. The Biden administration should have known that if they were going to do a NEO, Bagram would be a much safer, much more orderly place to do it from. But the Biden administration and President Biden, because of the troop cap that he put in the country, shuttered Bagram and meant that we couldn't do a NEO there, meant that we were stuck doing a NEO out of a small airport in the middle of Kabul, the capital, and that we were stuck doing that NEO in the middle of Kabul while the Taliban were in charge, which meant that we were stuck doing our NEO while we had to rely on the Taliban to provide security outside the airport. These were choices that President Biden made, choices that he made to not fix the SIV problem before the withdrawal. And these were choices that the State Department made not to declare a NEO until the Taliban had taken over Kabul. And obviously this put US service members in grave danger. And we saw the great loss of life, 13 US service members killed on August 26th, dozens of service members wounded, some of them grievously, some of them with life-altering and permanent injuries, and close to 200 Afghans killed as well. So the SIV problem and the question of when to do NEO, the Biden administration just did not put in the thought and planning that it needed to. And we all saw that end in disaster in August 2021.
What did Saigon mean to them? Why did they keep saying this isn't Saigon? What were they trying to convey, Jerry?
Yeah, so in Saigon in 1975, that is the capital of South Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese swept south towards the South Vietnamese capital. And the US had to do a very rushed withdrawal from that country as well. And as one quick aside, and sort of the connection here for how President Biden thinks about these things, he joined the Senate a little bit too late to be a major player in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. So how he tried to make his mark in 1975 was he was the most vociferous person in the US government opposing efforts to save South Vietnamese allies, people that had fought alongside us during the Vietnam War. He even had a quote, and this is very close to being his exact quote, where he said that we don't have a moral obligation to save one or 100,001 South Vietnamese. And part of our book is that we think that President Biden sort of took that same mentality towards our Afghan allies decades later, because you could see that same sort of callousness play out. And while the Biden administration was claiming that this was not going to be like Saigon, Biden said you won't see helicopters, flying off the U.S. embassy this time around. I think that what happened in Kabul in 2021 was probably worse than what happened in Saigon in 1975.
James, I come to you. The military can see what's going on. They don't have the State Department need for acronyms. The Secretary of Defense, General Lawson, is former CENTCOM. General McKenzie is CENTCOM. General Miller's on the scene. They know that Kunduz falls August 5th. At that point, are they telling the White House this is going to all go over the cliff? Are they saying that out loud, James?
They're not saying it to the public, and that's for certain. They were at that point warning the Biden administration and the State Department in particular, because the State Department is the agency in charge of announcing a NEO, a non-combatant evacuation, basically an evacuation of American citizens. That's the State Department's responsibility. The military cannot announce it on its own. It cannot declare one. But so they were definitely telling the administration that things were falling quickly. In fact, General Vasily, who was the commander Admiral Vasily, who was the commander of U.S. forces Afghanistan at the time, had said even a few months back before August, so we're talking June, that the trajectory of Afghanistan, this direct quote, the trajectory of Afghanistan is in a downward spiral and likely not recoverable. And to that end, the military was trying desperately to get the administration to pull its head out of the sand, or to stop just wish casting and kind of engaging in this magical thinking that everything is going to be okay. But that wasn't obviously, it was not the case. But to give you just a side by side of what the military was seeing and what the administration, and in particular the State Department, was doing at the time, when Admiral Vasily, made that assessment in June of 2021, that the Afghan, government was basically in a death spiral. The State Department locked down the U.S. embassy in Kabul because of COVID for several weeks, canceled all, meetings with exit interviews with Afghan interpreters who were scheduled to leave the country, stopped providing almost any services at all, and in fact confined most of the staff to their rooms other than outdoor isolated exercise. And so just the seriousness and the gravity of the situation was completely lost on the administration, or at the very least, perhaps that they didn't, perhaps they didn't prioritize what was happening to those SIVs, but they were warned, and they were warned repeatedly over and over.
The book is Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. Ghani, the president of the country, a man who has been kept in power by the U.S. and NATO for some time with full understanding of his responsibilities, flees the country in a helicopter, and he now is in the Middle East, to my understanding, and living out his life explaining himself. That event, however, means that there is no leadership in Kabul. The police chief, the generals, they all flee, grabbing helicopters from HKIA, the airport at the center of the city, and fleeing. So, Jerry, I come to you at this point. We begin a crisis at HKIA. We need to describe that airfield. Where was it, and why was it a catastrophe to choose HKIA for an evacuation, Jerry?
Yeah. So the acronym HKIA, Hamid Karzai International Airport, or often called HKIA. This is an airport in the middle of Kabul, and this is the place that the Biden administration had chosen to do its evacuation from. So we should have chosen Bagram, and the State Department, in fact, was warned even by the Command Sergeant Major at Bagram that to do a NEO, an evacuation through Kabul airport, would be a disaster, that it should be done through Bagram. But because of President Biden's decisions, we shutter Bagram. We have to do the evacuation through Kabul airport. Well, now when Ghani flees, the Afghan government collapses, and the Taliban walks into Kabul, now we have to do an evacuation through Kabul airport, but we have to do it with the Taliban in charge and with reliance on the Taliban right outside the gates of HKIA. And so and keep in mind, President Biden, in his mind, he tried to reduce our U.S. military footprint to something like 600 troops. That was not nearly enough to maintain order, and you see that in those dramatic scenes when the airport was overrun in those early days of mid-August 2021. Tens of thousands of Afghans trying to flee the country, the scenes of Afghans clinging to planes, and even as planes take off, Afghans falling to their deaths. We call that it's called the Night of the Zombies in our book, and it was a terrible, terrible situation. Because of Biden's decision to reduce U.S. troops to that level, the Taliban is able to walk into Kabul. All that we have is the airport, and we have to flow now 5,000 to 6,000 troops back in. And now these U.S. service members are tasked with getting out thousands of Americans, tens of thousands of Afghan allies, and others, all while the Taliban is right outside the gates. And the Taliban is sometimes turning Americans away from the gates, sometimes beating Americans, turning our Afghan allies away, beating our Afghan allies, sometimes killing Afghans within full view of some of the Marines in sniper towers. And at the same time, we have a massive ISIS-K threat as well, because the first thing that the Taliban did when they took over Bagram on August 15th is they opened the doors to the prisons at Bagram. And those prisons held something like 2,000 ISIS-K terrorists, dozens of al-Qaeda terrorists, and thousands of Taliban fighters. And they opened those doors. And among those ISIS-K prisoners who were freed was the man named Abdul Rahman al-Logari, who would go on to carry out that terrorist attack at Abbey Gate at Kabul airport on August 26th. And so the simple matter is that keeping Bagram was smart for about 10,000 different reasons. But one simple fact is that if we had just held on to Bagram, the suicide bomber who killed those Americans and killed those Afghan civilians, he would have been sitting behind bars rather than being able to carry out a terrorist attack.
John, if I may, I'd like to just jump in and add kind of some color about what transpired on the night of the 15th, because as Jerry mentioned, or on the 15th and kind of bleeding into the morning of August 16th. As Jerry mentioned, Americans saw the images of Afghans falling from departing U.S. Air Force planes, and we kind of discuss who those Afghans were in detail in our book in Kabul, and also kind of what led up to it. But just to paint the scene, because we only had 600 troops in the country, which is about commensurate pound for pound with what you would have guarding an embassy in almost any other Middle Eastern nation. The military had to rely on the Afghan military to help defend the perimeters of HKIA, of the Kabul airfield. And when the Afghan military fled, half of the perimeter was completely exposed. And the military did not have the manpower to defend that entire area. And on top of that, several units were flying back and forth to the embassy to evacuate all of the State Department staffers who were still there because the State Department had not evacuated them beforehand. So you had, several hundred troops at the most trying to basically guard the most critical infrastructure on the airfield. And the gates were opened, and tens of thousands of Afghans swarmed the airfield, and the troops on the ground had to form basically a protective perimeter, standing shoulder to shoulder surrounding the command center at Hamid Karzai International Airport, because if the command center was overrun, then there would be no evacuation at all. Everything would be lost. And in fact, during that time, several of the control towers at the airport were destroyed by the mob. And so the Marines and Air Force special operators had to conduct air traffic control for the entire evacuation, sitting underneath a tent using handheld radios and maps. And it's just an absolute feat of ingenuity that they were able to do it at all. But that was that's kind of the backstory behind the scenes that everyone saw when everyone was flooding the airfield. And to be able to clear the runways so that reinforcements could land, the military kind of made a last-second decision to put 2 Apache attack helicopters in the air and have them fly, just a few dozen feet above the runway, and use the force of the propellers to clear the crowd. And things were that dire.
Yes, I understand. We're talking about the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, the 82nd Airborne elements of, and the Marines, 1st Marine Division elements of, coming in very quickly to conduct the NEO. And just a quick, James, I got the sense that they'd been on other missions and were given the hurry up to gather themselves together and get into Kabul. Is that correct? That was, they were not waiting on the tarmac for this catastrophe. They were drafted at the last moment. 30 seconds.
That's generally correct. The Marines from 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, were in Jordan and other places. They were part of their mission was to be on standby to some degree. The 82nd Airborne troops were in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and they both got spun up at the last second. They had absolutely no idea what they were facing, and they had to do their best.
The book is Kabul, James Hasson, and Jerry Dunleavy. When we come back, it gets worse. James, to start with you, because I want to do the physical layout of the airport that they had. Military improvises. I understand that. You don't get, you go to war with the army you got. Okay, so we have Abbey Gate is the important one because that's where the attack will happen on the 26th. There's North Gate, there's East Gate, there's South Gate, and there's Black Gate. All of those gates had to be manned by the arriving Marines and arriving 82nd Airborne. They're arriving not having really good information about what they're going to find. Those gates, what did they look like, James? How did they seal them or keep them so that there was a passageway through, but they could defend them? What did they look like?
Yeah, I think it's important first to just give listeners and viewers a quick picture of what the airport as a whole looks like. And it almost, I would describe it as like a fat cigar with, just a very kind of long tip at the end, sticking out kind of on the eastern side. And so obviously kind of on that tip was Eastgate, just a little kind of to the west. So if you're looking at the map, kind of to the left was Abbey Gate, where the suicide bombing attack happened. And there was a main entrance to the gate as well, kind of further on the south side. And that basically South Gate. And there was basically a, for lack of a better word, highway kind of leading right up to it. And then on the far northeastern side, you had the North Gate, which was also open. And each of those, kind of conventional gates, because we'll get to the gate the CIA used, and other gates that Special Operations Forces used in a second. But each of those gates varied somewhat in terms of what they looked like. I think Abbey Gate is kind of the, that's where the bombing happened. That's where a lot of the evacuations were coming through. And I think that's probably the most important one to describe. And so they had basically there was a long channel, a long kind of not a road, but kind of like passageway leading up to the gate for a few hundred meters. And at the end of that, where it kind of exits into what's the rest of Kabul proper, the Taliban had set up several moving containers or U.S. forces did to set up those moving containers to prevent car bombs from coming down the avenue of approach. But the Taliban ended up manning all of like that position. So they were sitting on top of them. And in between, kind of right, but running not quite down the middle, but down that path, there was also a sewage canal with all kinds of, basically human refuse. And initially, people stayed on one side or the other of that canal running down the avenue of approach, and in the first few days, but there were still swarms. And once you get to the front, there's kind of an interior holding area that they called the inner gate, which once they let people through, they were vetted, they were searched, the State Department would verify their papers, and then they would get into the airfield itself. But outside, kind of the main gates at Abbey Gate, it was an absolute swarm. I don't know how else to describe it. You had people packed shoulder to shoulder to the point where when Marines jumped in at points or tried to push back and push the crowds back, the compacting was so intense that it pressed their body armor on each side, up against their chest and their back, and made them feel like they're about to suffocate to death. And but the canal itself also filled up, because as people got more desperate, they decided to just jump into literally, human feces. The I don't know if I can say this on broadcast air, but the SH canal, the poop canal, basically is how the Marines described it. But people were wading through poop to try and get there, and they're packed all the way up to the front. Because it was so frenzied and so chaotic, there were Marines, standing kind of on the wall right outside the outer gate, and they could see below them, too far away for them to get to, babies that got knocked out of their mother's hands and were trampled. They could see other, women being trampled to death. They also, once people got closer to the gate, where there was, that razor wire, kind of that circular wire that you'd see outside prisons in the United States on the top of the walls, that they had a lot of strings of that right outside the gate and right outside the walls. And women would try to throw their infants over that wire and across the wall in hope that the U.S. Marines on the other side would catch them. And other times when people were getting trampled, like when a mother felt that she was about to get trampled to death, she would hold her baby up and hand it to a Marine standing on the wall, so at least her baby survived. And the Marines also encountered women who said that they'd been brutalized by the Taliban, and when those women were told that they didn't have the necessary paperwork to get inside the airfield, some of them would throw themselves on the razor wire trying to kill themselves so that they didn't have to go back through the Taliban checkpoints.
Jerry, the mob is gathering during the day in that heat without adequate resources, and then it remains into the evening when they close the gate. They're vetting some people through all the time, and this goes back to the SIVs. Who was it that they were letting in those critical days, 16 through 26? Who came in and who didn't? And how did they sort that out? And who made the decision? Was state present?
The State Department's guidances on who could get in, who can get out were, who could get in and who wasn't able to get in. Those guidances were shifting constantly. And that was a constant source of frustration for the Marines who were manning the gates. On top of this, there were not nearly enough State Department consular officers on the ground at HKIA to do the job that was necessary to be done. And so there would be many instances where Marines would need a consular officer to check someone's paperwork or to vet people, and there just wouldn't be one available. So these rules were constantly changing. The priorities were supposed to be Americans, legal permanent residents, and Allied nation nationals and Afghan SIVs, but the Biden administration had never done a proper job of coming up with a plan about how to get all of those SIVs out. On top of that, they sent out, the State Department did, a sort of blank visa form to thousands and thousands of people. And that blank visa form ended up getting airdropped and copied to thousands and thousands of other people. And so one of the main ways that the State Department came up with to help SIVs identify themselves at the airport ended up actually being completely useless when the Marines were trying to identify people. And so not only did the State Department not have a good plan about how to get SIVs out and our Afghan allies out, but then the plan that they came up with on the fly ended up actually hindering the Marines' efforts to identify people in the crowd. And so the State Department completely dropped the ball here. And this is why you had private and veteran-led groups, both in the United States and some of them in Afghanistan proper, coming up with other ways to try to get our Afghan allies to the gates. But it's pretty much the most chaotic situation that you can imagine. As you can see from our book, the Marines and the soldiers at the gates did a tremendous job, especially given the impossible situation they were put in. And these outside groups stepped up where the State Department fell down. Kind of as we say, sort of the American people at their best, but the American government pretty much at its absolute worst.
Jerry, the directive from Washington was always "and their immediate families." What did Washington mean? How did the Afghanistan people interpret that?
Yeah, well, again, this is something that was constantly shifting. Immediate family to Americans generally would mean your children. In Afghanistan, the sense of family is much, much broader than that. And so people were bringing extended family and the like, and that helped to swell the crowds as well. And so there were many, many situations where we had, thousands and tens of thousands of people piled up, and people were having, these Afghans who were getting out, even if they themselves were qualified, sometimes their families wouldn't be. And so they would have to make the decision about whether to leave their extended family behind or not. Other times the guidances would shift, and so these massive extended families would be allowed in. Because the guidances were shifting, it constantly meant mass confusion in the crowd, confusion among the Marines about what they were allowed to be doing, and was always contributing to the swelling of these crowds. And because of the swelling of the crowds and the chaos in the crowds, it was obviously a very good opportunity for ISIS-K, which was roaming around the airport, to sneak an attack in.
I'm speaking with Jerry Dunleavy and James Hasson. The book is Kabul. It's the story of the retreat from Afghanistan and Kabul in August of 2021. The story is unfinished, but there are pieces we can speak to. The CIA maintained the Black Gate, it was called, opposite the CIA's Eagle Base. There's also the concern of the NSU. These are special acronyms that need interpretation. James, the CIA was working very hard, out of uniform, in and out, bringing people through what you describe as a hole in the wall. The military, the Marines and the 82nd Airborne, manning the gates, they knew about this, or some did and some didn't. But in general, I take it this was extremely helpful to get the most critical SIVs and Terps and members of government, the people most in danger, plus American citizens out. Is that how it was used, James?
As a general matter, yes. So as you mentioned, there were the main gates that we talked about before, and then there was what was called Black Gate, which was essentially a little more than a nondescript hole in the wall. Basically, if you well-disguised doors that could open. And that was kind of basically on a direct line to the CIA's compound in Kabul. And that was well known as Eagle Base, is what it was called. And that was to the north of the airfield. It was kind of to the northeast somewhat. And there were a lot, the CIA at times would, they also had their own helipad inside the airfield. So at times they would fly their own evacuees just straight from Eagle Base to straight to the onto the airfield. But in other instances, there were people that they would meet at a rendezvous point at a gas station, kind of basically south of where Eagle Base was, but north of where the airfield was, and kind of on a direct line between the two. And oftentimes the CIA would use the NSU, which that's an acronym for National Strike Unit.
Who was the NSU?
Yeah, I'd love to get to that. Those are Afghan paramilitary forces that were originally stood up by the CIA shortly after the 2001 invasion, and were trained by CIA paramilitary operatives. They were a very, very, very well equipped, almost to the extent that U.S. Special Forces would be, minus some of the more classified or sensitive types of equipment.
Right, but here's what
operated in
James, I need to know. They made a deal with the U.S. military, the forces at the airfield, to get families out. And that deal made very difficult the evacuation, because you estimate in your book up to 30,000 were evacuated related to the NSU, and that's a quarter of everything.
Yeah, that's correct. And so that 30,000 includes all of their family members. And I'll get to the reason why that number was so high in a second. But to your point, when back to when the airfield was completely overrun, there were only, like we said, there were only several hundred American troops on the ground. There was no way that they could possibly clear that airfield, short of just committing mass brutality and shooting unarmed civilians. And so what the CIA did at the time is they approached those NSU units that they had been training and advising and using for the last 20 years. And they struck a deal. They said, if you guys come in and if you help us clear the airfield, then we'll get you and your family members out. The NSU is well known for, you call it harsh tactics. Other people call it war crimes or brutality. But they got the job done very quickly. They were running people off the crowd, and that's why we ended up relying on them.
Jerry Dunleavy, James Hasson, Kabul. The airfield is surrounded by people who are desperate to leave Afghanistan. At the same time, the airfield is surrounded by the Taliban, who are partners, so-called, by the State Department and the White House back in Washington. The Taliban has a very strong relationship with al-Qaeda. It has an unclear relationship with ISIS-K, called in the region. Why this matters now is because it's unsolved. We're going to go to Abbey Gate and what happens the afternoon of August 26th. But it's important to prepare the ground here. And Jerry, I come to you. You are a principal and you are an investigator of this matter, and it's ongoing. We need to understand what we know so far about the Taliban, their relationship to ISIS-K, and especially the Haqqani Network, which my understanding is a stand-in for the al-Qaeda group now, today. But also, there's evidence that they worked with, when it suited them, ISIS-K. Who were the Haqqanis, and where were the Haqqanis during this evacuation, especially on the 26th of August? Where were they, Jerry?
It's a great question. So I am an investigator on the House Foreign Affairs Committee looking into the Afghanistan withdrawal. I'll just note that I'm just here as the co-author of this book. But the relationship that the Haqqani Network had with all these groups is very important. So the Haqqanis are a key force inside the Taliban. They also have a long-standing relationship with the Pakistani intelligence services, the ISI. On top of that, the Haqqanis have a very long relationship with al-Qaeda as well. And Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's the head of the Haqqani Network, who was the top Haqqani commander in 2021 and who is a top member of the Taliban government today, he has a very close relationship with al-Qaeda, and by some national security experts is considered to be essentially a member of al-Qaeda as well. And but by the way, when we killed Ayman al-Zawahiri in 2022 in Kabul, he was the number two for Osama bin Laden. Zawahiri was hiding out in Sirajuddin Haqqani's safe house. So the relationship there is very strong. On top of that, the Haqqanis had at the time a relationship with ISIS-K. So the Taliban, of course, the Taliban and ISIS-K are foes oftentimes. However, when it suited them, they would come together to carry out attacks against the US military and the Afghan forces, especially in Kabul. Kabul attack networks that were set up by ISIS-K oftentimes would use facilitation and help from the Haqqani network to carry out those attacks. Basically, attacks that the Taliban might not want to take credit for or have anything to do with, but we're happy to help ISIS-K carry out. And on top of that, in 2021, and today, the head of ISIS-K, the leader of ISIS in Afghanistan, was himself a former commander in the Haqqani network who had longstanding relationships with top members of the current Taliban government. And so you have these relationships set up. And what's important to keep in mind is that at Kabul airport, the Taliban controlled pretty much all of Afghanistan at that point, including all of Kabul, and was providing quote unquote security outside the airport. And it was the Haqqani Taliban specifically that had gained power in Kabul at the time and was in charge outside the airport. And so the Haqqani Taliban had set up what are called their Badri 313 units, which are their suicide units outside the airport. And one of the Haqqani commanders even commented that the first thing that he did when he showed up at the airport was surround it with 1,000 suicide bombers. So you combine that with the fact that the first thing that the Taliban did when they got to Bagram was free those ISIS-K prisoners, including the guy who would go on to carry out the suicide bombing. Not exactly what you would want from your security partner at the airport.
James, it's August 26th, 11:30 a.m. in the morning. My notes from your book. Very excellent reporting. A mass cal event is warned. What is mass cal? What are they talking about, James?
Mass cal is the military acronym for mass casualty. It's when you have, it's exactly what it sounds like. When you have a whole lot of severely wounded or, killed in action troops in a single event, in that, you need immediate response and reinforcement from other units, such that basically the unit itself cannot take care of their own.
Right.
And
not only does the mass cal warning go out to all the commands, the Marines, the airborne, all the attendant units, planes coming in and out, the mobs close. They had a detailed identification of what to look for. A man with a shaved head, dressed in black, and a backpack with 3 arrows on it. Very detailed. And you're reporting, and there's some ambiguity here. The reporting says that the Reaper 2 sniper team, their snipers are up high. They identified someone very, very close to that that description, very close. We're looking at what's enraging here is we're looking at really good information. In other words, the CIA or somebody knew what they were talking about. What did you learn from this, James, reading it over now, all these years later?
Yeah. Let me circle back really quickly just to finish what you asked about the Moscow, because I think this is really important. At 11 a.m., the intelligence was so specific and so reliable that at 11 a.m., before the attack occurred, about 5 hours later, about 6 hours later, the commanders at the airfield ordered the night shift of the medical units to return to duty and to be on standby so that they could treat wounded. That is how significant, serious, and concrete that threat of a suicide bombing was. To your second point about the description of the bomber himself, as Jerry mentioned, that Biden administration has never named him. They've never acknowledged him, even though it's confirmed with 100% certainty within the intelligence community that who he is. We actually include his picture in our book Kabul. But the description that you're mentioning came from testimony from Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews, who was a Marine sniper stationed outside of Abbey Gate. But importantly, there were also two other independent interviews given by both Army and Marine service members during the Pentagon investigation that confirmed Sergeant Vargas Andrews' account and his description, which I think is very important, because Sergeant Vargas Andrews was never interviewed by the Pentagon for any of this, and he ended up sustaining a loss of 2 limbs. But as he testified to Congress, and as backed up by transcribed interviews given to Pentagon investigators, he was given the Army Psychological Operations Team received a threat description, basically a be on the lookout description for a potential ISIS suicide bomber directly from CENTCOM, from Central Command. And the PSYOPs team, which is the PSYOPs are a member of U.S. Army Special Operations Command. They took that directly to the Marines in the sniper tower. They passed it along, and around 11 a.m. or around that time, roughly, maybe a little after, the Marine team in the sniper tower, whose call sign was Reaper 2, identified a person who met this description exactly and was acting in the way that you would expect a suicide bomber to act, and that he was not trying to get to the gate. He was fidgety. He had a bag, all of that. And they called the report up to their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Brad Whitehead, and they asked for permission to engage. And he told them, I do not have that authority to give to you. And they said, respectfully, sir, who does? And he said, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. And there was never an answer about that. And they lost the bomber in the crowd. And a few hours later, carnage happened.
Jerry Dunleavy, James Hasson, the book is Kabul. We come to the after effect. 13 Americans lost their lives that day, Marines in the Ghost Company, and many more were wounded. Many Afghan nationals lost their lives, maybe 170, maybe more. There were lots of orphan children. The bomber himself, however, is revelatory because the war goes on. The war against al-Qaeda, the war against our adversaries, the war against the Afghanistan people who are in desperate situation today, abandoned by, as far as I can tell, their former partners, now prey to the exploitation of other nationals. That would be the PRC and that would be Pakistan's bad actors, the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghanistan Taliban, al-Qaeda, ISIS. And the puzzle here raised by Jerry and James is why the State Department doesn't want to tell the American people what it knows to be true, who the bomber was. His name was al-Logari, Abdul Rahman al-Logari, where it came from, what his associations were, and why this is important to understand, because al-Qaeda has not left Afghanistan. ISIS has not left Afghanistan. And the U.S. is conducting what it needs to do to gather information and yet not conveying to the American people. Jerry, I come to you. I don't want to be political here. I want to just understand the use or the explanation of why the American people don't know what's in your book. Why haven't we been told, Jerry?
Well, I think we haven't been told because the truth is extremely inconvenient. Abdul Rahman al-Logari, who was the suicide bomber at Abbey Gate that killed those 13 U.S. service members, he had been captured in a joint CIA and Indian intelligence operation back in 2017. He'd been planning to carry out suicide attack along with some of his compatriots in New Delhi back in 2017. But he was rolled up, handed over to the CIA. The CIA interrogated him. The Afghan government interrogated him, and he was put in a Parwan prison, which is a prison at Bagram. And the Biden administration, of course, decided to shutter Bagram and abandon it. And which was a terrible decision, as we've laid out for so many different reasons. But among those was that it left these prisons teeming with terrorist prisoners, and among them was Logari. And the first thing the Taliban did was free these thousands of ISIS-K prisoners. And so for the Biden administration to be honest about who the suicide bomber was and how he came to be at Abbey Gate would be for them to admit that giving up Bagram was a terrible decision, and perhaps that trusting the Taliban to defend you against ISIS-K was also a terrible decision, when the first thing that they do when they take Bagram is free all those ISIS-K prisoners. So the Biden administration has not wanted to talk about this element of the entire disaster, and it's pretty clear why.
The ISIS-K today has a commander. His name is Mujahir, Shah al-Mujahir. He's said to be at large in your book. I understand maybe he's been apprehended by now, but I doubt it. Al-Qaeda remains intimately involved in Afghanistan. ISIS-K has a on-again, off-again relationship with the central government. All of this would help the American people understand how complex the situation has become and what needs to be done, what remains is a threat. So in closing your book, and this is to flatter you both, I'm left with many, many really good questions, and that's a great success you've done. Many good questions. This is not a fairy tale that ends either happily or unhappily. This is an open-ending story. And I come to you, James, because what we have here is one more question that maybe can be answered. Was it a complex attack? This is the equivalent of saying, was there only one gunman? What do you think, James?
I think there's a lot of evidence to say that this was not a single individual who was acting completely on his own, as the narrative has been. We don't, in Kabul, we do not reach a conclusion on that because, well, it's very, very difficult to reach a conclusion on that, given that immediately after the attack, we packed up and we left, and there was, very little opportunity to interview anyone on the ground who were not U.S. troops, and to really do a full investigation of what happened. And in fact, I believe it was General Sullivan who acknowledged this. Actually, it was General Farrell who led Brigadier General Farrell, who led the investigation, the Pentagon's investigation, conceded that the investigation was limited because they left and they don't have any evidence in front of them, and they couldn't interview any Afghans who were on the ground at all. That said, the Pentagon concluded that it was not. They said that there was, any gunfire was probably just, reactionary gunfire from Marines who were on the ground, from, potential Taliban individuals firing warning shots, and of the like. But there's a lot of evidence that is inconsistent with that conclusion. And first of all, one of those is, one piece of that is that the pretty consistent testimony of almost all of the junior Marines who were at the gates, who all believe that this was a complex attack. Some of them described seeing individuals. Some of them described hearing, bullets snapping above their head, which if you've been in a war zone, you know exactly what that's like. It's very difficult to mistake. But there's also, some other evidence in that the trajectory, according to the Army Explosive Ordnance Disposal Team's investigation, the projectiles from the suicide bomber only hit a few feet below the canal, but they found people with lower extremity injuries who were their knees, who were several feet below the blast range and could not have been caused by the bomb. So there's a lot of questions still to be answered.
Jerry, 30 seconds. My reading of your book says that there were no Taliban casualties in the mass bombing at Abbey Gate. Is that accurate to your understanding?
Yes, the Abbey Gate attack by the ISIS-K suicide bomber killed American service members and Afghan civilians and Afghan allies. It didn't kill any members of the Taliban.
Jerry Dunleavy, James Hasson. The book is Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. The first book in the series that these gentlemen are responsible for. I'm CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.